Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Ready to talk about the future of dairy farming? We're going to be diving deep into some pretty crazy stuff. Robots milking cows 24/7, DNA being used to create super cows, and get this, milk made without any cows at all.
Yeah, it's wild. The dairy industry is going through some major transformations right now.
So we've been digging through a ton of research articles, reports, all sorts of stuff, and a few key themes keep popping up. We're seeing a huge focus on precision dairy farming, making things more sustainable, genomics, automation, and all these digital platforms changing how farms operate. Oh, and of course, we can't forget about alternative dairy products. Those are becoming pretty popular.
And it's all happening against this backdrop of climate change, which is adding a whole other layer of challenges and opportunities for dairy farmers.
Right. So let's break it down, starting with this precision dairy farming thing. It's basically like having fitness trackers, but for cows. Sensors on their collars, ears, legs, you name it, tracking their every move.
Yeah, it's all about gathering data, right? Understanding each cow's health, how much she's eating, even when she's most likely to produce the best milk. It's about treating each cow as an individual and optimizing for their well-being and, of course, milk production.
Makes sense. So instead of just looking at the herd as a whole, farmers can zoom in on each individual cow.
That's the idea. It's like having a high-tech toolkit for modern-day cow whisperers. And all that data is incredibly valuable. It gets fed into these sophisticated analytics platforms, which helps farmers make more informed decisions.
So instead of relying on gut feeling, they're using data to guide their decisions.
Exactly. It's about making data-driven decisions that benefit both the cows and the farm's bottom line, whether it's adjusting feed, spotting potential health issues before they become serious, or figuring out how to get the most milk from each cow.
Okay, now for the really futuristic stuff. We're talking robots milking cows around the clock. These automated milking systems, or AMS as they're called, are already being used on about 10% of Australian dairy farms. Pretty cool, right?
Yeah, that 10% is really interesting. I think it shows that we might be reaching a tipping point where AMS becomes more common on farms, but there are still some hurdles.
Like what? It
Right.
seems like a no-brainer to me. Who wouldn't want a robot doing the milking?
Well, think about the upfront costs. These systems are a serious investment, potentially a lot for smaller farms to handle. And then there's the whole internet connection thing. You need a really reliable connection for these systems to work properly, and that can be a big problem in rural areas.
Makes sense. So bigger farms with more resources are likely the early adopters, but even with those challenges, the benefits seem pretty impressive.
They really are. Some Victorian farms using AMS are seeing a 15–20% increase in milk production, which is huge. And then there's the labor savings. That's a huge plus in an industry that's struggling to find workers.
Okay, so more milk, less labor. Got it. Now let's talk about sustainability because I was really surprised to learn how much technology is being used to make dairy farming more eco-friendly. Seems to be a big thing here in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this huge push to reduce the environmental footprint of dairy farming, and technology is playing a key role in that.
Like what kind of technology?
Well, one thing we're seeing a lot of is solar-powered irrigation systems. Farms are using solar panels to power their irrigation, which obviously saves money, but also helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Like that Tasmanian farm we read about. They slashed their energy costs by 30% and their carbon footprint by 25% just by switching to solar-powered irrigation.
Exactly. And that's just one example. Farms are also recycling water, using high-tech manure management systems that turn waste into biogas, which can then be used to power their operations. It's really cool stuff.
It's amazing how they're turning what was once a problem, like manure, into a valuable resource. Now get ready for this because this one's pretty mind-blowing. Have you heard of genomic breeding?
Oh yeah, genomic breeding, that's a fascinating area.
It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It does. But it's actually happening right now. It's all about analyzing a cow's DNA to figure out which ones have the best genes for things like milk production, disease resistance, and feed efficiency. It's like they're breeding super cows.
So they're basically playing matchmaker for cows, but they're using DNA to find the best matches.
That's a great way to put it. They use artificial insemination to bring those superior genes into the herd, improving the overall genetic makeup of the cows over time.
But is it actually working?
Oh yeah, it's definitely working. I read a study about a New South Wales farm that used genomic testing and saw their average milk yield increase by 10% in just 5 years. That's pretty remarkable.
So it seems like Australia is really leading the way in this field, right? With organizations like Dairy Bio doing some really cutting-edge research.
Oh, absolutely. Australia is definitely at the forefront of dairy genomics. It's one of the most exciting areas in the industry right now, and it has huge potential to change the way we think about dairy farming.
Speaking of exciting developments, let's talk about robots. And I don't just mean the milking robots.
Oh, there's so much more to say about genetics.
Uh-huh, I know, we'll come back to that. But I'm really intrigued by these robots in the barn.
It is pretty futuristic, isn't it? We're seeing robots taking over all sorts of tasks like feeding, cleaning, even monitoring cow health. And it's not just a gimmick. A recent report from Dairy Australia found that 20% of large-scale farms are already using robotic technology.
20%? Wow, that's a lot more than I expected. I guess it's not just a sci-fi fantasy anymore. So what are the main advantages of using robots, besides the obvious coolness factor?
Well, robots are great because they work 24/7, they don't take breaks, and they're incredibly precise, which means less waste and better efficiency. For example, robotic feeding systems can really reduce feed waste.
Yeah.
I read about a Queensland farm that implemented one, and they reduced their feed waste by 15%, and their labor costs went down by 25%.
15% less waste, that's amazing. But all this talk about robots makes me wonder, are we heading towards farmerless farms?
It's a good question, but I don't think we'll see farms completely run by robots anytime soon. Robots are great at repetitive tasks, but human expertise is still essential. You need someone to manage the technology, analyze all the data, make decisions about the direction of the farm.
So it's more of a partnership then, robots and farmers working together.
Yeah, exactly. It's about using technology to enhance what humans do best. But speaking of technology, all these robots are generating massive amounts of data, which brings us to these digital platforms that are changing the game for dairy farmers.
Right. We touched on data earlier, but this is beyond cow tracking sensors. It's like having a virtual assistant for the entire farm, right?
That's a good analogy. Platforms like AgriWebb and FarmIQ are becoming really popular. They help with everything from managing the herd and tracking finances to staying on top of compliance reporting. It's all about making operations more efficient and giving farmers better tools to make informed decisions.
And then there's blockchain technology. I have to admit, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how it all works.
It's definitely a bit complex, but think of it as this unbreakable digital record-keeping system. It makes the supply chain super transparent and traceable. Imagine being able to track a carton of milk all the way back to the cow it came from.
That's pretty cool. Consumers would love that. It definitely builds trust, knowing exactly where their food comes from.
Absolutely. And we're actually seeing this happen in Australia.
Hmm.
There's a South Australian dairy cooperative using blockchain to track their milk from farm to table, and it's been a huge hit with consumers, really boosting their brand image.
Okay, so we've got these high-tech cows, robot farmers, data overload. It's
Yeah.
becoming pretty clear that the future of dairy farming is going to look very different from what we see today.
It is, and it's changing rapidly. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to talk about, and it might be the most disruptive of all: alternative dairy.
Right, the plant-based milk craze. I have to admit, I've been trying out oat milk in my coffee lately. But is this really a threat to traditional dairy farming?
It's definitely shaking things up. The Australian alternative dairy market is growing like crazy, and it's predicted to grow by 10% every year for the next 5 years. And it's not just plant-based milk anymore. We're starting to see lab-grown dairy products too, using something called cellular agriculture to create milk without cows.
Hold on, lab-grown milk? How does that even work?
It's pretty amazing. Scientists take cells from a cow's mammary gland, and they basically trick them into producing milk in a lab. No cows involved.
Is this stuff even available yet?
Not commercially yet, but there's an Australian startup that claims to have created lab-grown dairy that tastes just like regular milk. They're aiming to launch it commercially by 2024.
Wow, 2024, that's not far off at all. So what does this mean for the future of Australian dairy farming? Is it a threat? An opportunity?
It's a really good question and probably a bit of both. But before we get into that, there's another factor we need to consider: the impact of climate change.
Right. Droughts, heat waves, all of that.
Yeah.
How are dairy farmers dealing with those challenges?
Well, technology is playing a big role here too, helping farms adapt and become more resilient.
Give me some examples.
One thing scientists are working on is developing climate-resilient cow breeds, cows that can handle hotter temperatures and more extreme weather. And then there are all these water-efficient technologies like drip irrigation and moisture sensors.
Those are some really smart solutions. Are there any Australian farms that are already doing really well with this whole climate-smart farming thing?
Absolutely. There's a farm in Western Australia, for example, that reduced their water use by 20% and still maintained their milk production thanks to their super efficient irrigation system.
20% less water. That's incredible. It's a great example of how innovation can overcome some of the toughest challenges.
It really is. And it shows how resilient and adaptable Australian dairy farmers are. They're really embracing these new technologies to make sure their farms can thrive in the future. It's pretty inspiring.
It really is. Okay, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. Cow tracking sensors, robot milkers, lab-grown milk, climate-resilient cows. It seems like this industry is undergoing a massive technological revolution.
It definitely is. And it's happening fast. But it's not just about the technology. It's about how all these advancements are intersecting with science, sustainability, and the needs of consumers. And of course, it's about the ingenuity and hard work of farmers who are committed to providing high-quality dairy products.
Absolutely. So where do you see the industry heading in the next 5 to 10 years? Any predictions?
That's a tough one. It's hard to say for sure, but one thing's for certain, the dairy farm of the future is going to look very different from what we see today.
So what do you think? High-tech havens with robots and sensors everywhere? Or maybe a blend of tradition and innovation?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's going to be a fascinating journey, and I'm sure there will be plenty of surprises along the way.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in all the tech stuff, the robots, DNA testing, milk made in the lab, but, we shouldn't forget about the people.
You're so right. We've been talking about all these cool advancements, but what about the farmers? How are they handling all these changes?
Well, honestly, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some are really embracing the changes, seeing them as a way to make their farms more efficient, sustainable, and profitable. But, others are a bit more hesitant.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's a lot to take in, all this new technology and everything. What are some of the concerns they have?
Well, one of the biggest things is the cost. Adopting new technologies can be really expensive, especially for smaller farms. And then there's the whole learning curve. These new systems can be complicated. Not every farmer is, a tech expert.
And I imagine there's also that fear of, robots taking over their jobs like we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Change can be scary, especially in an industry that's been around for so long, one that's always been done a certain way. But what's good is that there's a lot of support available to help farmers through this transition.
Like what kind of support?
Well, there are government programs and initiatives from the industry that offer funding for training and can help with the cost of getting new technology. And there are organizations like Dairy Australia that provide a ton of resources and guidance to help farmers navigate all of these changes.
So it's not just a case of here's the new tech, figure it out. They're actually getting some help to adapt.
Exactly. The focus is on empowering farmers, giving them the information and the tools they need to make the best choices for their farms.
Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe the cow in the room, haha. Some of these things, like this lab-grown dairy, seem pretty intense. Do you think they could actually replace traditional dairy farming completely?
It's the question everyone's asking, isn't it? It's still pretty early, but I think it's unlikely that traditional dairy farming will just vanish, at least not anytime soon.
Why not? Plant-based milk is already huge, so what's stopping lab-grown dairy from taking over?
Well, for one thing, traditional dairy farming is so deeply rooted in our culture and the economy. It's a way of life for tons of people, and it's a crucial part of our food system.
That's a good point. Plus, let's be real, people love the taste of real dairy. There's just something about it that's hard to replicate.
You got it. Technology has gotten really good, but it's still tough to perfectly copy the taste and texture of dairy products. And then there's the whole question of, will people even accept lab-grown dairy? Plant-based milk has gone mainstream, but this is a whole other thing.
It does seem like the dairy industry is at a crossroads, with traditional farming facing these challenges from new technologies and shifting consumer preferences.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. And it's not just about competition. It's about figuring out how traditional and alternative dairy can, coexist, maybe even work together.
Work together? What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Traditional dairy farmers could partner with tech companies to implement precision farming or use data analytics to improve their operations. Maybe we'll even see farms start incorporating plant-based ingredients to create, new and interesting dairy products.
That's interesting. So it doesn't have to be this either-or thing. It's more about finding a way to build a more diverse and resilient dairy industry.
Exactly. It's all about being open to change, finding ways to adapt to what consumers want and what's good for the planet.
And speaking of the planet, we need to talk about climate change again. That's a huge challenge for dairy farmers, right?
It is. We've discussed some solutions, like climate-resistant cows and better irrigation systems, but tackling climate change needs a much broader approach. It can't just be individual farms making changes.
So what do you mean by broader?
It means looking at the entire dairy supply chain from start to finish, from the farms to the processing plants, the transportation, how it gets to the consumer, and finding ways to reduce its impact on the environment.
So it's thinking beyond just what's happening on the farm itself.
Exactly.
Mm.
It's about minimizing greenhouse gases at every step, reducing transportation distances, even being mindful of the packaging used. It's a big, complicated issue.
Sounds like it's going to take a lot of effort from everyone involved.
It will, but there's this sense of urgency. People are ready to take action. We're seeing dairy companies setting big sustainability goals, investing in renewable energy, trying to figure out how to reduce their carbon footprint.
That's good to hear. So what about us, the consumers? What can we do to help make the dairy industry more sustainable?
Consumers have a lot of power. By making smart choices about the dairy products they buy, they can really influence the industry. It's about sending a message that sustainability matters.
So supporting brands that are doing things the right way, thinking about how much dairy we're using, and maybe even trying out alternative dairy options.
Exactly. Every choice we make has an impact. It's about being mindful of our own impact and supporting companies that align with our values.
This has been a really interesting conversation. We've gone from the details of precision farming to these big questions about the future of dairy itself.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and it really shows how complex and dynamic the dairy industry is.
Absolutely. It seems like the future of dairy farming is going to be shaped by all these different things: technology, sustainability, what consumers want, and the resourcefulness of farmers all over the world.
It's definitely a story that's still unfolding, and it's exciting to watch.
Before we go any further, I want to turn it over to our listeners. What are you all thinking? What stands out to you from everything we've discussed?
We've shared a lot of information, and we're really curious to know what you think about the future of dairy farming. What are you hoping for? What worries you? What do you see happening in the years to come?
Keep those thoughts in mind because in the last part of our deep dive, we're going to be taking a closer look at Australia's role in the global dairy landscape.
We'll explore what sets Australian dairy farming apart and delve into the unique challenges and opportunities that our farmers are facing.
Stick around. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the future of dairy farming.
And we're zooming in on Australia this time.
Right. We've talked about these big global trends, but what about Aussie dairy farming? What makes it special? Where do we fit in the whole scheme of things?
Well, Australia really punches above its weight when it comes to dairy.
What do you mean?
We may not be the biggest milk producer in terms of just, sheer volume, but we're known for having really high quality milk and for being committed to doing things sustainably.
So it's more about quality than quantity for us.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Australian dairy farmers have this reputation for producing some of the best milk in the world.
Why is that? What makes it so special?
I think it's a few things. We have these really strict quality standards. Our cows are healthy, and we have a pretty clean environment, relatively speaking.
And you mentioned sustainability earlier. We've talked about some of the eco-friendly practices, but are there things Australian farms are doing that really stand out?
One of the big things is pasture-based grazing, which is great for the cows and the environment.
Right, letting them graze naturally instead of just feeding them grain all the time.
Exactly. And there's this growing focus on using renewable energy, saving water, and reducing those greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, we talked about that Tasmanian farm that's using solar power and saving a ton of money and energy. Are there other Aussie farms that are doing cool stuff in terms of sustainability?
Oh, definitely. There's a farm in Victoria that's using a rainwater harvesting system so they don't have to rely on outside water sources as much.
So they're basically catching and reusing rainwater. That's really smart.
It is, right. And then there's this other farm in New South Wales. They're using this process called anaerobic digestion to turn cow manure into biogas.
Anaerobic digestion, isn't that something about bacteria breaking things down without oxygen?
That's the one. And they're using that biogas to power their farm.
Wow, so they're turning waste into energy. That's like the ultimate form of sustainability.
It's a pretty awesome example of how farmers here are finding creative ways to tackle environmental challenges.
Yeah, it seems like they're really committed to producing milk in a way that's good for the planet and also makes good business sense.
Definitely. It's not just about, doing the right thing. It's also about staying competitive because more and more consumers are demanding sustainably produced products.
It's like we were talking about before. consumers are paying attention to where their food comes from and what kind of impact it has on the environment.
Exactly. And they're willing to pay more for products that are made ethically and sustainably.
So there's a real incentive for Aussie dairy farmers to be eco-friendly, it seems like.
Yeah, definitely. They're already known for high-quality milk, and now they're becoming leaders in sustainability. They're at a really good spot to be successful.
Yeah.
But it's not all easy for them.
Right, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. What are some of the challenges they're up against?
Well, like we talked about, there are the fluctuating milk prices, climate change, and competition from all these alternative dairy products. Those are global issues that everyone's dealing with.
Right, so those global challenges are felt here in Australia too.
Yeah, absolutely. But there are also some things that are unique to Australia, like the cost of producing milk here is going up.
Yeah, everything seems to be getting more expensive these days, right? Feed, energy, labor.
Exactly. And it's hard to find skilled workers, which makes it tough to, keep the farm running smoothly.
Plus, there are all the regulations. I bet those are a headache to keep up with.
Oh, totally. It's a lot for farmers to handle. It all makes it harder to make a profit.
So how are they coping with all this? Are they giving up?
No way. Australian dairy farmers are really tough, they're resilient, and they're not afraid to try new things. They're adopting technology, like precision farming and robots, to try to be more efficient and cut costs.
Yeah, we've talked about some pretty amazing examples of that already.
And they're not just doing it alone. They're really good at working together, collaborating.
What do you mean?
Well, like, they're working together to make their supply chain stronger, to improve their marketing so they can sell more milk, and they're advocating for policies that support the dairy industry.
So they're joining forces to figure things out and make their voices heard.
Yeah, exactly. There's a real sense of community, and they all have this shared goal.
It seems like Australian dairy farming is this interesting mix of, like, tradition and innovation, hard work, and a commitment to quality and doing things the right way.
That's a great way to describe it.
Okay, so this deep dive has been really eye-opening. We've learned a lot about where dairy farming is headed, all this crazy technology, the challenges, and also these really inspiring stories of how people are adapting and finding solutions.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey to explore all these different aspects of the dairy world.
And we hope you, our listeners, feel more connected to this industry now, more informed about where your food comes from.
It's a story that's still being written, and it's exciting to be part of it.
Absolutely. We encourage you to keep learning about it, ask questions, and think about the choices you make as a consumer. You can support the kind of dairy industry you want to see.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
It's been great having you along.